Good morning. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. This morning, we have two of the world's great geopolitical strategists and political and thinkers with us, Robert D. Kaplan and Parag Khanna, who will be talking about one of the world's strategic and geopolitical challenges, China. For those of you who are first-time comers to the Foreign Policy Research Institute, FPRI, we're a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia, and we hope you'll check out our website. We have lots of articles, and most of our events we make videos of, so you can relive them if you already saw them, or peruse and listen to the ones you haven't heard, as well as our podcasts. We have podcasts. I'd like to say before we get started, a thank you to our supporters and our board, many of whom will be on this call this morning, and appreciate all you do to make these events possible. Bob Kaplan needs no introduction to most of you on the call. He is the holder of the Robert Strauss-Hupé Chair in Geopolitics at FPRI, and he's a member of our board of advisors. He's also the best-selling author of, I think it's 19 books at this point, including his forthcoming The Good American, which is going to be published in January, which is about Robert Gersony, a great American who made contributions to our foreign policy that he's the greatest American you never heard about. So he's also written The Coming Anarchy, highly influential article, Balkan Ghosts, Asia's Cauldron, Monsoon, The Revenge of Geography, and many more. For 3 decades, he's reported on foreign affairs for The Atlantic, and his articles appear in major publications, both in the United States and internationally. He was previously a senior advisor at the Eurasia Group, chief geopolitical analyst for Stratfor, a visiting professor at the U.S. Naval Academy, senior fellow at the Center for New American Security, and a member of the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board and the U.S. Navy's executive panel. Foreign Policy has named him one of the world's top 100 global thinkers. In the 1980s, he was the first American writer to warn in print about a future war in the Balkans, and Balkan Ghosts was chosen by the New York Times Review as one of the best books of 1993. He's also, in 2004, received FPRI's own Benjamin Franklin Public Service Award, and he received that in 2009. In 2004, his alma mater, University of Connecticut, awarded him the Distinguished Alumni Award. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Bob.
Well, thank you, Raleigh. Thanks for that introduction. And my job today in this hour is going to be to talk about my friend and colleague, Parag Khanna, who we've known each other for over 20 years, actually. And about Parag's new essay. It's a long essay. It's in a very interesting new journal, online journal called Noema, which is Greek for thinking. And it's one of several new online journals that publish very classy, erudite, complex pieces at the leading edge of the debate. The kind of thing that mainstream media used to cover 20 or 30 years ago, but do less and less, almost not at all now. And Parag, what I like about Parag is that he travels constantly. He is always on the move around the world. He's not one of these people who is an affable operator in Washington with big ideas about how to organize the globe. He really gets deep. He gets on the road into the small towns, granular. And this piece about China, which is called All Roads Need Not Lead to China, subtitle, Beijing has much to lose should it continue down the path of imperial overstretch. This article, this long essay is very much introduces you to Parag in just the way it begins. Let me just read this. He talks about, in railways and roads, it began to inch westward along the Yellow River and through the narrow Gansu corridor. I wonder if many people in Washington even know what the Gansu corridor is, but it's the kind of thing that Parag knows about. So let me turn it over to Parag to introduce the piece, talk about it generally, and then we can have a back and forth.
Great. Thank you so much, Bob. And I want to thank Nick. I'm not sure if Nick is actually on the call, but needless to say, when Nick calls, I leap at the opportunity to do an event with him, and very grateful to FPRI for organizing this event and assembling such a large group. And for those who don't know, Bob has been a hero of mine since I was about 15 years old, and a real mentor to me since, as he pointed out, more than 20 years, since I was about 21 when we met. So for half my life exactly, and therefore it's fair to say that I don't know what my work would ever have become without the existence of Bob and his work. So I'm really grateful for yet another opportunity, Bob, to have this dialogue with you. And it would be great to jump right in because we are talking about the country that Washington can't obsess enough about, China. But there's a couple of, I think I want to make a deeper point throughout my opening comments tonight, which is that we need to talk conceptually, because we can, we can debate minutia. We can have lots of micro level kinds of questions about specific disputes that China has with its neighbors, about the contours of our relationship with China. But the one thing that I want people to leave this conversation with in a lasting way is the concept of geopolitical complexity. I want people to understand that the context of the US-China dynamic is occurring in a different framework from previous geopolitical rivalries. And the words geopolitics and complexity really don't often go together in any conversation or discourse. In academic circles, they very rarely are brought together. There's only a couple of scholars who are kind of pushing the envelope theoretically in looking at what actually the mathematical principles of complexity, but even if we just take the social science approach to complexity and use just that schematic and embed geopolitics in that, what does the world look like in that way? And that's a literature that I'm a big subscriber to, a big fan of. I think it's extremely important that everyone here, whether you're students or academics or professionals, that you start to get used to this idea that we cannot simply import analogies from the past, whether it's 19th century Europe, whether it's Cold War bipolarity, into the 21st century. There are new variables in the system that bring about this complexity, and both the US and China are susceptible to them. And that is the background, really, to understanding the way in which I'm sort of interpreting China. Certainly, there are a lot of things in common between China's rise and empires of the past. I've gone to great lengths to describe China as what I call a supply chain empire, and to compare it to the rise of the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, those powers that use their merchant naval fleets and East India companies to gain their footholds globally, to be trading powers before they were military powers, to use import substitution and industrial policy to build up their financial reserves, and then to invest in the kind of modernization that made them into the superpowers that they then became. And that's precisely the path that the United States of America took as well. So there are certain commonalities between China's rise and others that are worthy of exploring. But there's also complex dynamics in a global system level that we've probably never had before, as a result, obviously, of globalization, intensification of relations, what Bob has often called the kind of increasing claustrophobia of the world as a result of connectivity. And that does change the underlying character of the system. And not nearly enough time, Bob, I hope you agree, is spent on that, because we are so busy looking at China as a sui generis entity and thinking, you and I obviously both appreciate geography as much as any other people, but we tend to still have a kind of almost flat earth thinking about geopolitics rather than thinking about the world as a much more complex organism with lots of feedback loops. And again, that's the background. And I'm glad you mentioned the traveling, by the way, because I did mention that piece, driving the Western Highway and what's happening.
Yes, Parag. I want you to do justice to this piece, because this piece is a granular geographical travelogue almost. You're talking about the complexity of roads in India leading into Tibet and on and on. Give us a feel for that.
Right.
Take us into the piece.
Yeah. And so, Belt and Road is really what this is about to some degree. And Belt and Road, it's very important to understand from a Chinese standpoint, only acquired a name 4 or 5 years ago. And by the way, there are some people in China who have buyer's remorse about the idea of having come out with such a big brand, because China was practicing Belt and Road for about 25 years prior to giving it a name. And once it acquired a name, it captured everyone's imagination, and it became this lightning rod with which we come to identify Chinese grand strategy. But what's so interesting in and of itself is that we think about geopolitics and the advancement of geopolitical interests largely in military terms, but China is not yet a global military superpower. Its grand strategy for becoming a global superpower has been largely based on the supply chain premises and priorities. And that's where Belt and Road comes in. Now, Bob and I both have been traveling for decades around and watching Chinese infrastructure projects. Back in my first book, about 15 years ago, I was traveling in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, and I said, China wants to win the new great game, and it wants to win it by building the new Silk Roads. And one of those roads is the Western Highway through Tibet. And that road that begins in central China, Sichuan province, parts of Sichuan and Yunnan province that connect to Tibet, these major roads and railways that now have Lhasa as a junction point and then move westward. And I drove along the Western Highway in southern Tibet while it was being constructed. And so that was a hellish trip. And it was actually having multiple near-death experiences during that 2.5 months that I spent driving just to get from Lhasa to Urumqi, passing through the fabled Silk Road junction of Kashgar. Now, to cross from Tibet into Xinjiang is one of the most bizarre climatological experiences you can ever have. And the same day that you are in a snowing blizzard at elevation of more than 20,000 feet in Xinjiang, you will then drop vertically straight down into the Taklamakan desert of Xinjiang. And you will have Bactrian camels running in front of your vehicle, and you will strip down from your jacket and coat into a t-shirt and be sweating in the same day. I've only had that experience in China. And I must say that, we all have different ideological views and opinions about China and what it represents. But of all the road trips I've taken in my life, and Bob and I probably both count countries like Libya as our favorite, most scenic, historical places to spend time, almost incomparable. But the most beautiful place I think I've ever been is Western Tibet, in this high Tibetan plateau, where you have canyons that are like the Grand Canyon, but at this incredible elevation. And China,
all right. Parag, this whole area where Tibet, Xinjiang province, the Taklamakan desert, the Pamirs, the Tian Shan, the Himalayas, the Karakoram, I'm naming mountain ranges, all kind of come together in this vast knot in the border area of Nepal, Tibet, Western China, and Afghanistan and Pakistan. My most incredible travel experience was on the Pakistan-Chinese border. It was flat. It was just completely flat, not a hill, but I was at 17,000 feet at the pass there. And imagine being at 17,000 feet and not seeing any mountains. And then you descend into Pakistan, you go down in elevation into the Karakorams, and you see these vast mountains.
Right.
So it's incredible. Now, this is very complex territory in terms of when people read about the road, the clash between India and China, over Tibet, over their border area. It's very complex to follow. And you start out your piece describing it. can you walk us through the geography of these roads? Because your piece is about about how the Chinese think of imperialism in the 21st century as transportation links, essentially.
Or more broadly, connectivity, right? Because as we know, they are
Yeah.
seeking, they've just unveiled, for example, their framework for global data security, right? The internet is a critical infrastructure. Infrastructure falls into three categories, right? Transportation, energy, and communications. So in terms of transportation, they have a leg up as a provider, in a way, a supplier of this global public good. And I want to make another contrast. In as much to the extent that we in America think of global security as security is a global public good, and America is the foremost provider of that good, China thinks of itself as a provider of infrastructure, and that as an equally significant global public good. And much of the world has been very receptive to China's provision of that, because the world population has tripled since 1945. Most of the human population lives in poor post-colonial countries, which are the locus of that population growth. And they have had no new infrastructure development for the last 75 years because they have been on their own since independence. And what China has done is respond to a market failure, the market failure of Western multilateral institutions to finance infrastructure. And that's what Belt and Road is. And China starts to do it not to be benevolent, of course, but in order to secure its own supply chains and to diversify the geography of those supply chains, to be able to import Middle Eastern energy and commodities without depending only on the Straits of Malacca, and in order to export more through multiple transportation routes to Europe, which is its largest trading partner. And that's the origin, really, of Belt and Road. So it really began in a way defensively, you might say, because China is a victim of the Malacca trap. And it, in the 1990s, found itself suddenly as the global center of manufacturing. The factory floor of the world found itself vulnerable to the Malacca trap. And it was still a relatively poor, developing, and
all right, explain, Parag, the Strait of Malacca. What is it? Why is it a trap for China?
Well, the Strait of Malacca is sort of China is because China lies, though it's a rimland state east of the Strait of Malacca, most of China's energy imports flow through this narrow maritime channel, which, by the way, happens to be 600 meters to my south. That's the beach that I hang out on every day, is technically part of the Strait of Malacca, which is why I chose this location to live at. So it reminds me of geopolitical lore. But so China's energy imports, commodities imports flow through the Strait of Malacca, and the majority of its manufactured goods exports also flow out through the Strait of Malacca. It is a very narrow channel, the busiest waterway in the world, always jam-packed really with ships. When I take a ferry over to Bintan Island in Indonesia, you literally are on a little hovercraft that's swerving between these gigantic 50, 60,000 TEU container ships. It's really quite an experience. When you fly in and out of Singapore, as you have, Bob, you're just flying over this parking lot really of container vessels.
I mean, all the oil and gas is in the Middle East. And China's cities, its heavy population, is in East Asia. And to get from the Indian Ocean in the Middle East to the South China Sea in East Asia, you've got to go through the Strait of Malacca. And I sailed through the Strait of Malacca on a US destroyer. And what's interesting is that it may only be a few miles wide, but only half of it is navigable because of rocks in the channels, so that it's a very hair-raising experience, for a destroyer to go through the Strait of Malacca, not hit a lot of these small boats that don't even come up on radar, and yet avoid these shoals and rocks. So it really is a narrow naval.
Now getting back to the infrastructure, but defense becomes offense, and this is the critical inflection point. We tended to we were somewhat dismissive of Belt and Road because it really was, we thought of it, again, not as a major global public goods provision, not as military assertiveness, but simply as bricks and mortar infrastructure. But at a certain point in time, roughly 5-6 years ago, people started to understand how China was weaponizing Belt and Road. not just viewing as a diversification of transportation routes, but rather as pathways towards asserting financial leverage, forcing countries into debt traps, establishing special economic zones and even military beachheads in order to protect its supply chains and its various depots and sites. And that's why we've seen the basing in Djibouti and the submarines in Pakistan, and then the Gwadar port situation with Sri Lanka, and this idea of a so-called string of pearls. So, this is how, again, infrastructure gets weaponized, and that's how we've really awoken to Belt and Road and started to view it through a security prism, if you will. When it comes to China's neighbors, this is not new to them. Bob and I both spent a fair bit of time in Mongolia. I remember actually, Bob, you wrote a great piece for The Atlantic a long time ago about Mongolia and the American presence there. When I go to Mongolia, I'm always sitting with people from the railway ministry, looking at the proposals that the Chinese have sent them about which rail lines they want to build directly to their largest mines, and how they pitch to Mongolia that these railways will benefit Mongolia because they'll also become transportation corridors to Russia and make Mongolia part of the Belt and Road. But of course, Mongolia is extremely weary of this. And every country on China's periphery has been, sort of caught in this situation where, again, they're poorer countries, they need the infrastructure, but they don't want the debt and the political leverage that comes with it. Many of these countries already have 80% of their investment coming from China, 80% of their exports going to China. They already feel like they are sort of vassals of China. So how do they push back? And this is what is happening with India and other cases.
Yeah, this is the heart of your essay.
So we have taken this linear view where just because China builds a road in another country, it is basically colonizing that country. Never mind that to some degree, these are actually mutually beneficial relationships. Even the RAND Corporation and American institutions have done studies of Belt and Road and said, look, if you look at the econometrics of transportation linkages and the trade benefits, it's actually been win-win. And of course, win-win is a very common Chinese diplomatic expression. But our own analysts have looked at the ways in which countries have expanded their fruitful economic ties with each other through Belt and Road, and also assessed it to be, relatively speaking, win-win. There are some countries caught in these debt traps, so to speak, but we have to remember that a lot of these countries had most of their outstanding debt to China prior to Belt and Road, right? So they always were, because, again, I want to be clear, we also abandoned them, right? We did nothing for Laos or for other countries, or Tajikistan or Kyrgyzstan. They did not have access to international capital markets. Interest rates were far too high. And so China came along and said, we'll do it to you. Now, this is where things get so interesting, because we've taken this linear view where China's, paving over the world and therefore conquering and dominating the world. And that's its path towards, a hegemonic status in Asia, if not Eurasia. However, what it has unleashed is what I call the infrastructure arms race. And that's the crux of this piece, and certainly broader work that I've been doing. Because if you think about it, about 3 years ago, once again, the consensus became that China is weaponized Belt and Road, and it is China's vehicle for global expansionism. That's when the arms race kicked in terms of the response. So in the last 3 years, we've had the formation of the U.S. International Finance and Development Corporation. The European Union launched an Asian Connectivity Initiative. Japan and India launched their connectivity corridors. The U.S., Australia, and New Zealand launched their Blue Dot Network. The EU and Japan launched a Sustainable Infrastructure Finance Initiative as well. So none of these acronyms that I just threw at you existed 3 years ago. So why do they exist now? Because they are a response to Belt and Road, right? Challenge and response. Belt and Road, started to take it seriously. We woke up as a community of either Indo-Pacific states or Western allied democracies, and we said, we are going to now respond. So the result is you don't have just one player in the infrastructure marketplace. It's not just China. Hence the punchline, all roads don't necessarily lead to China. China builds some roads, but not all the roads. And our media tends to skew the picture around what's been happening in the infrastructural integration of Eurasia over the last 30 years. we only report on Chinese roads. We only report on Chinese ports. We only report on Chinese infrastructure projects at all because it raises those alarm bells. Whereas if India does something or Europe does something or Japan does something, we completely ignore that. The truth is there's a fairly intense competition going on the ground to be the financial and infrastructure logistics provider for these strategically located, poor developing Asian countries. And these countries have a voice.
Yeah, you really see this in like the competition between the Chinese, Pakistani Belt and Road from Western China, Xinjiang, south through Pakistan to Gwadar Port on the Arabian Sea, and what seems to be the competing Indian-Iranian energy pathway from Central Asia down through Eastern Iran to Chabahar Port, which is actually very close to Gwadar, but one's on the Iranian side of the border, the other's on the Pakistani side of the border. So that would be like, a major implication of what you said about this competition to build infrastructure to essentially unite the Eurasian world island by land and by sea as well.
Right. And what you're referring to with the second route is the north-south Silk Road. That is the way that the Indians refer to it. It's the way that the Russians refer to it. The Azeris refer to it that way as well, because each of these countries is obviously critical in this. So it's again a reminder that the Silk Roads of the past and of the present and future are multi-directional. It's not literally a hub and spoke model with China at the center. So lots of roads are being built, and many of them involve China, but not all of them. And much of the connectivity that is taking place, and some of the most interesting corridors, are connecting Central Asian countries to each other that don't have any sort of with no role for China as such. And you see this happening with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan looking at their future ties with Iran via Turkmenistan and via Afghanistan. And these are things that they're doing in their own interest. It doesn't require China to stimulate it, but it's going to have implications for the opening of Central Eurasia, for these new transportation corridors. And these will not be Chinese-dominated corridors.
Parag, we've got some questions coming in, all right? One member of the listening audience, the viewing audience, wants to know what you think of the Thucydides trap. In terms of China being a rising power and therefore upsetting the international system, because at the very beginning of our conversation, you seem to reject historical models a bit. So the viewer wants to know, what you think specifically of the Thucydides trap theory.
Well, for one thing, we should always challenge rather than blindly accept historical analogies. We should always evaluate situations as they are. And if we can learn from past experience, obviously we should. But we shouldn't pretend that history is a purely cyclical process. So in that sense, as a matter of principle, I would challenge it. Now, the Thucydides trap and the project that Graham Allison led at the Kennedy School that it's based on. If you think about the 16 case studies, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 15 out of 16 are based on Western sort of dyads or pairs of conflicting powers, sort of incumbent power or hegemonic power and rising challenger. So it can't necessarily shed a tremendous amount of light on a situation such as the US and China, which is operating at a global scale rather than a European scale, and with far more actors involved. Because today's world is not simply a bipolar rivalry in which the two powers define the system itself. They are both operating within a much more complex, globalized, interdependent system in which there are other powers such as the European Union, India, Russia, Japan, and so forth. So we cannot really look at the Thucydides trap dynamics in those case studies and map it onto US-China when the actors are so different. You have an Asian power this time in the mix, and you have a multipolar landscape that you're dealing with, and you have a much higher degree of global interdependence than in those situations. So there's very valid analytical reasons to not take the view that the US-China rivalry needs to unfold in the patterns of hegemonic rise and decline and, you know, competition for unipolar hegemony in the ways that that many of those examples demonstrate. That said, it's certainly very useful, but not necessarily in this situation.
Okay, another question, Parag. What role does Russia play in Central Asia vis-a-vis China? Do you see this as a source of future friction between Russia and China? And can it be exploited by the United States?
This is an interesting one, and this is not a new proposition. You know, there have been periods going back to, you know, certainly obviously the 1990s, in which we've thought about whether or not Russia could be brought back into the Western fold, you know, whether it should even be offered NATO membership, or, you know, what kinds of status Russia would have vis-a-vis the West. There's still, looking back on the NATO expansion of 1999, you know, fierce debates about what a mistake that you know may have been in terms of alienating Russia. My sense is that Russia has, you know, obviously it's a very independent-minded sort of ethos, seeing itself as a Eurasian power, and not in the spirit of either Peter the Great, you know, wanting to strive to be accepted by the West predominantly. Now, of course, we see that that to the extent that it has close alignments with other major powers, China would rank at the top of that list. And from China's point of view, Russia ranks as the most compliant country in the world in the Peking University Index of countries that more or less follow the sort of 99 or 100 different kinds of regulatory or political regulatory modifications that make it compliant with the Belt and Road Initiative. That said, a lot of it could be temporary. They have a sort of, you know, marriage of convenience. They're dating, but they're not married. China, if Russia is suspicious of any one country in the world, it's also, of course, China at the very same time. And they appreciate the great power asymmetry there.
Yes, and Russia and China really, you know, they have a long history of border differences, of actual wars with each other. I've always believed that Russia and China are allies, are tactical allies. They could never really be strategic allies. And that they may have come to a modus vivendi in Central Asia, where Russia provides the security and China provides the economic hydrocarbon infrastructure. And the Russians are fine with Central Asians selling oil and gas to China, that means there's less competition for Russia selling natural gas to Europe, which otherwise might come from Central Asia. So Russia kind of feels that it's lost to China in Central Asia, but can live with it in a way. Is that, do you agree with that?
Well, but Russia does continue to push for things like the Eurasian Economic Union, the Customs Union, and so forth. And that does more or less annoy Central Asian countries, because they know it's largely a play at kind of regulatory hegemony, and they don't like it. They also don't like, of course, being under China's thumb too much. We see the backlash in Kazakhstan, for example, right now. Certain issues that relate to sort of, you know, security breaches and demographic issues and so forth. So there's tensions now between Kazakhs and Chinese populations. Obviously, the Uyghur issue is a point of friction between the two countries as well. So the Central Asians aren't necessarily comfortable, you know, simply being dominated by either, nor being merely subject of a Russo-Chinese kind of Sino-Russian condominium over them. They really do want to stake their own kind of role in the world, and you see this in the foreign policy doctrines of countries like Kazakhstan that are associated with NATO, that are really looking multi-directionally. And I think that other countries, to the extent that they can use the growing foreign investment that they're receiving and the revenues that they've generated from oil and gas exports, to kind of build a more confident sovereignty. And so, they try as much as possible to prevent either Russian or Chinese actors from buying upstream ownership and dominance of their key strategic assets, whether it is mines or oil and gas deposits, their utilities and energy grids. So again, it's the micro politics of who controls infrastructure that's playing out in Almaty and Tashkent and Astana. And there what you find is that neither Russia nor China is necessarily winning, right? They're trying as much as possible to be sort of open and connected economies.
What about Baku and Azerbaijan, the port there? We have a question from one of the viewers about that. That's a place that I've been to a number of times, but not in recent years. I'm sure you may have visited more recently.
I have. I spent part of last summer there. It was it was wonderful. It's always one of those places that's always charming to go back to and see how its modernization has sort of taken root. So yes, they want to be part of this trans-Eurasian logistics set of networks that would bring. Also, I mean, this gets back, by the way, to your point about Russia being content with Central Asian countries selling their oil and gas to China so it doesn't compete with their sales to Europe. However, were it not for the volatility or the unpredictability and unreliability of Turkmenistan, actually the Central Asian energy would already be going across the Caspian or even around through Iran, through various swaps, into the Baku-Ceyhan pipeline to Europe. So Central Asians have had the ambition, right, to also want to export to Europe, but it just hasn't worked out politically. Azerbaijan, given its stability, has been hoping to revive, and maintain those efforts to be a energy transit corridor and a logistics hub. They have a good railway network now through the Caucasus that stretches into eastern Turkey. I literally took that train this past summer, and it's quite modern. So they're trying very hard to be this sort of Caspian hub. The issue, though, is of course that Turkmenistan is still not a country you can do business with, and Iran is obviously not open either. So it's tricky. In time, I do think that Azerbaijan is going to play that role. But by the time that happens, let's remember, commodities prices will continue to be low. Oil and gas will lose significance. And B, there will be many flourishing overland transportation routes. And so the clunky process of using, trans-Caspian shipment as well as, freight rail through Azerbaijan may be less attractive, which is why the north-south route is probably going to be of equal, if not greater significance in the long run for Azerbaijan, because you have the Iranian population yearning to open up. And as you know, there are more Azeris in northern Iran than there are in Azerbaijan.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Iran is in its own way a prison of nations, of Azeris, Turkmens, and others. We have a basic question. Is Belt and Road a bubble? In other words, they're getting these countries into debt. Can these countries pay back? Are these projects going to go fiscally bust, so to speak? Or is this just the Chinese way of doing things? Because they're thinking in a mercantile and an imperial sense, not in the strict Western financial capitalist sense.
Well, I like to say that grand strategy is not made by MBAs, right? So it's not really about return on investment financially for China. It never has been. It is first and foremost, from beginning, middle, and end, it's about geographic resilience. And I know that this resonates with you, Bob. This is about paying any price. China will pay any price to not be beholden to the Malacca trap. We must absolutely be clear about this. It's the beginning, middle, and end of the purpose here, because it is not to be benevolent. And it is mercantile, initially mercantile, now imperial. And I think that's also important to distinguish. As I said, it's an arc that began as a defensive measure and is now seen as offensive. But let us be absolutely clear about this, because I think this will shed some light and perhaps, open debate with others around, how coherent Belt and Road is. I want to be clear that in at least, 15 years that I've been traveling around China as periphery, I do not see China having a master plan, right? I see China as actually winging it to a large degree. Belt and Road is a concept that was cobbled together 2/3 of the way through the projects that China has already been executing over the last quarter of a century. It is really a hodgepodge. It is not an all or nothing proposition. It is not all debt traps, nor is it all empire, or is it? It's not a bubble, nor is it an organizing principle. It is a collection of mostly bilateral relationships. Many of them are quite weak and incipient. Others are simply a repackaging of the relationships that have been around for 60 years, like Pakistan, which is in many ways the only country which, in and of itself, based on the reduced total volume of fiscal allocation and investment that Belt and Road represents, Pakistan is really one of the critical 2 or 3 anchors of the entire initiative. It doesn't matter so much that Chile or whatever the case may be, Mozambique is part of Belt and Road. What matters is what happens in Mongolia and Kazakhstan and Laos and Pakistan, right? The really important countries.
Pakistan.
Yeah.
Pakistan has only been, it's a country that's essentially controlled by the military. And even the military doesn't control its western borderlands. So the territory through which Belt and Road has to go, that's roads, railways, pipelines from western China, south through Pakistan to the Indian Ocean, it goes through parts of territories that the Pakistan army has never been able to subdue.
Right.
In half a century or more. And I was told that the Chinese only agreed to Belt and Road through Pakistan, from Kashgar to Gwadar, because they got buy-in from the Pakistan military. They never trusted the Pakistani civilian politicians on this. And it really is the heart of Belt and Road because it connects the east-west access with the north-south access.
The fact that China was able to, in a way, coerce the Pakistani military to really reallocate, a division, to protect this central infrastructural spine that CPEC represents is really revealing about the leverage.
CPEC? What is CPEC?
Is the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So
okay.
Belt and Road through Pakistan equals CPEC, basically.
Okay. Yeah.
And it is mostly, it's energy projects, transportation projects, and manufacturing, other kinds of industrial centers. And they are all, if you plot them on a map, these various sort of, dots that really form a spine, really an Indus River kind of, infrastructural corridor from the Karakoram range and their border in the north all the way down to Gwadar, near Karachi and Sindh into Baluchistan, which, as you rightly pointed out, is a geography that even the Pakistan army has had a hard time controlling. Now, CPEC, because it is so strategically important to Pakistan, which is so deprived of hard currency and foreign investment, has been, in particularly the last few months, been through a new parastatal organization, been put even more tightly under the control of the Pakistan military and removed from civilian or parliamentary oversight, because in as much as the Imran Khan government has been, striving to claim democratic legitimacy and genuine popularity and authority in economic matters, if not strategic ones, it's just too important to be left to the civilians from the standpoint of both China and the Pakistan military. So yet again, history repeats itself in this sense, and you have the Pakistan military, once again at the apex, of domestic power, which is, of course, unfortunate in some ways because it's a rent-seeking military, the likes of which you and I know from Egypt or Venezuela or Turkey or Indonesia in various decades. It doesn't exactly share the wealth, right?
It's the Pakistan China has given the Pakistan military an incentive to cooperate that the United States never provided the Pakistan military during all the years of the global war on terrorism. So despite the billions that the U.S. spent, or hundreds of millions that it has spent in Pakistan since 2000, essentially, we've never had the influence that China has gotten without. So it's very interesting. Look, we've gotten a lot of questions, and a lot of them are very good. I apologize to people who will not get their questions asked, but let me just jump around with the questions. One is about China in Africa. You know, East Africa, the East African coast is the western border of the Indian Ocean. So it's part of this greater Indian Ocean world that is coming into being, that China is developing through ports. Yet, is China winning Africa? In other words, is China running up against issues like human rights, basic governance? You know, is the United States competing well with China in sub-Saharan Africa? And if it is not, why not?
Well, the answer to the latter question is a resounding no, because let's remember that the U.S. shale energy, the biggest loser from the North American shale energy revolution, is basically Africa. Right? The petrostates of the Gulf can ride this out a bit longer with low oil prices. They have smaller populations to deal with, and they're monarchical, states. But Africa is the biggest loser because African energy exports to North America have dropped to basically zero. Let's remember that China is not in Africa for the long term. China is not anywhere for the long term. There's one thing that we can say, is not set out to sort of practice this mission simulatrice, right? It's there only in a transactional way. And you can see this in the transaction. So for example, now that every Chinese person has multiple mobile phones, their imports of cobalt from Congo are starting to taper. Right? They're happy. Just a few years ago, we were talking about how in Congo's negotiations with the IMF, they were in trouble, but they could count on China to come and bail them out because China was still, sort of really dependent on them. But guess what? I don't think China is going to care about Congo a couple of years from now. Here's a situation in a far more advanced state of degeneration, which is Angola. Because China does not want to be dependent on importing Angolan oil from an unstable country in Southwest Africa all the way through the Strait of Malacca again. China wants to have most of its energy imports come from Russia and come from Kazakhstan and come from indigenous alternative and renewable sources, and most certainly from the Arctic as well. It would rather import Norwegian oil through partnerships. That's why China has built so many gas LNG tankers, for example.
Yes,
so Angola has
on the Arctic. So feel free to talk about the Arctic in China.
So let's remember, there was reporting, I didn't go see this myself, but that there were so many Chinese oil workers in Angola that they had their own basketball league. But I think if you went to Angola today, you wouldn't see as many Chinese workers because Chinese imports of Angolan oil have been going down. And a lot of, by the way, China's stranded infrastructure assets are actually oil pipelines within China that are now the red on the Chinese balance sheet because China has moved towards the diversification of its energy supply so rapidly. So who gets screwed? It's actually these African countries one by one. So don't count on, again, this is not about ROI, right? China will build it for the time period it needs it. And if it should have amortized over 50 years, they don't care. So never make a linear projection about China in place X or China in country Y. It may just as soon not need it 2 years later and walk away. But that will be backfilled by Indians. Because guess whose imports of cobalt from Congo are rising now? It's India, because India wants to make its own mobile phones and it wants to make more batteries for electric cars and all of these kinds of things. So we tend to make a few mistakes. We make it all about China, but of course there are more Indians in Africa, given the colonial history, than there are Chinese in Africa. Africa is full of messy, multi-ethnic, post-colonial, quasi-democratic, highly corrupt, family and clan-driven states. Like India, right? Yes. A place I know pretty well. So the future of Africa, if anything, in terms of the messiness of doing business there, looks a lot like India of the 1990s, even up to the present. So it's very hard to imagine any kind of an allegiance in any meaningful way between African states for so long as any particular ruler is even going to last there, and China. And China knows this very, very well.
In the history of imperialism, Remember, everyone likes to criticize empires, but empires account for 90% of history. When you include the Indian empires, the Chinese dynastic empires, even the indigenous African empires like the Songhai, the Mali, and others, the Iranian empires. The most successful empires I've found are often governed by some big idea. It may not be a true idea, but they believe it. The Romans were about a civilizing mission in a sense that the best and brightest of the places they conquered were able to become Roman citizens. The United States Cold War great powerdom, which was an empire in all but name, was about spreading freedom and democracy. It was an idea. China doesn't seem to have an idea. But you gave me a thought about it. It's not a missionary empire. It's not spreading any particular form of governance. They'll work with any kind of regime, bad or good. But you gave me an idea. The closest I've heard about it was when you said earlier in our discussion about infrastructure. The Chinese are providing a global public good in infrastructure, as opposed to security and freedom, which the West is providing. And many people around the world who are not part of the middle class, the upper middle class cosmopolitan bubble, desperately need infrastructure. Am I on the right track here, Parag?
Oh, for sure. I mean, it can be wrapped in a loftier concept, of course, than just infrastructure, or even infrastructure as a public good. They do stand for the idea that there should be what they call a global symmetry. Right, not hierarchy, but symmetry. And a number of Chinese scholars have been writing in this vein. This is their masked way of talking about the virtues of a multipolar world in which they have, greater influence, and the role of the United States is, commensurate or sort of more narrow. And it's a language that opens the door to Russia viewing itself as a pole of power, to India thinking of itself in such a way, Brazil too, without obviously conceding that what they really want is to obviously replace the United States. But I don't think that's going to happen. Again, to me, the world is structurally multipolar. It's not a binary contest between two powers that hold together the predominant share of power in the global system. That is, again, I think, a false analysis. Of course, China has more ambition globally than, say, the European Union does, which doesn't really count as a strong super state. But that doesn't mean that the European Union has no power, or that India has no power and Japan has no power. And that's precisely why these network effects, where the Quad alignment between Australia, Japan, India, and the United States, to support, not only to coordinate better with each other in the Indo-Pacific, but also to provide material support, maritime assets to Vietnam and the Philippines and so forth. That matters. It isn't necessarily representative of an exact counterpole of an equal and opposite power to China itself. But China finds itself constrained by this network kind of behavior. And it's quite different from strict balance of power logic, because remember that Asians don't have in their history exactly, sort of automatic alliance patterns, the likes of which—
No, they have a tributary system, which is different, and which was actually more stable for quite a few centuries than the European balance of power system.
Except that it operated, on a limited scale of China and its weaker peripheral vassals in East Asia, but it was not representative of the full Asian landscape. For example, one can't talk about a return of a tributary system and the Asian landscape without reference to India, or without reference to Japan, without reference to Russia, without reference to Iran. So the tributary system works for Chinese strategic culture and informing their immediate geographic kind of realm. But the fact is that China's ambitions do stretch beyond the geography of that analogy to the tributary system. So China does not have a philosophy that reconciles its ambitions with the broader set of states that in fact have very much turned against China. So I think that's why China is very much in an intellectual trap.
Yes, Parag, we've had a number of questions about the Balkans, about the Czech Republic, vis-a-vis China. Can you talk just a minute or two about what China is doing in Europe? You know, because I know they've been operating and rebuilding the Greek port of Piraeus. They have ambitions to do something similar with Trieste in Italy, in a riverine port in Duisburg in Germany. You know, they have ambitions there.
Yeah, actually, all three places I've been writing about in the last couple of books. Piraeus was fascinating because there I met with the Greek management of the Piraeus Port Authority, and they were, quite frankly, they were proud to be working for COSCO because their terminals were better and stronger. They're legit. They were getting paid on time. They didn't have to strike. And if you looked over at the limp terminals of the Piraeus container terminal run by the Greeks, workers don't get paid. They're on strike all the time. So it was fascinating to see the proud Greek people grateful to be working, with the Chinese. And when you go to the COSCO-operated Piraeus Piraeus Port Authority, and you look at the maps they have on their wall, it actually is full of these multimodal linkages going inward into Central Europe. It isn't just the port; it's so much more. It's about the future logistics networks for the movement of manufactured goods in a maritime and overland way, which is why Hungary which they call themselves sometimes the Asians of Europe, have thought of themselves, have really been competing to become a kind of junction point for Trans-Eurasian rail sort of cargo future. Trieste, which I went to also a couple of years ago, the head of the Trieste port has been very keen to get that investment to modernize their port. And this is the interesting thing, and you'll love this, Bob, but you've already thought of this, but for the benefit of the audience, the distance over land from Trieste to Munich is half the distance, even though you have to go through Italy and you have to go through Austria and you get to Munich. That distance is half the distance from Hamburg to Munich, right? And the reason that the Germans,
Parag, we're out of time here.
Oh,
we're coming up on the hour. I want to thank you so much for this. We could go on literally 4 hours, and I'm going to turn it over to Raleigh Flynn, the president of FPRI, to close out the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bob and Parag. That was a terrific discussion. And I think I see 21 questions in the question and answer box, and I think we barely made a dent, which tells me we're going to have you both back at some point and perhaps save some of those questions. But terrific discussion. I've seen in the participant list, we have a lot of newcomers. So for those of you who are new to FPRI, please do come check us out online. We have, as I mentioned at the top of the hour, we have a lot of articles, we've got videos. FPRI is a place where we still do deep research. We do the story behind the story. You look at the mainstream media and you get glib, millimeter deep articles and broadcasts. That's not FPRI. We go deep. We are a nonpartisan think tank. We're based in Philadelphia. We've been around since the 1950s. Please check us out. Consider becoming a member. And to those of you who are already members and supporters, we say thank you. We could not do it without you. I hope you have a great day and a weekend, and stay safe. And thank you again to Bob and Parag. That was just terrific. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.